Hi there, welcome to What? Series 14 and about number 21. I've been going for a while on this. This one's titled Promises, Promises. And this is about Lot and Abraham separating. You see, Abram returns to the land that God promised him, and it says this: Then Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him, to the south. Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver and in gold, and he went on his journey from the south as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there at first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Notice it says here, to the place where his tent had been in the beginning. So he'd been down to Egypt, and he came back a rich dude, and he returned to the same place as before. He was right back where he started, where God told him to be. Essentially, Abram's time in Egypt was a wasted time, if you want to look at it that way. God could have and would have provided for his needs in Canaan, even though it was a time of famine. Now, Abram should not have used the blessing God brought him out of Egypt to as a justification for going there, even though God is great enough to bring good even when we disobey. Have you ever noticed that? And there is still a cost to be built on that disobedience. Abram's unbelief took him from his place of worship and led him into sin, and caused him to lead others into some sin as well. And it made him more confident in his ability to lie, unfortunately, than protecting the power of God. It even broke apart his family for a while. Finally, even an ungodly king rebuked him, if you want to read the previous chapter, to the place where the altar is where he went back. This is the point which he should have been, instead of torturing himself about his past sin. And he calls on God's name. Have you ever been in that situation where you've done the wrong thing and all of a sudden you go, hey, okay, God, what's going on here? We need to talk. That's where he's at. The church has always had the challenge of what to do with believers who slip into sin, and at what point do they come back into full fellowship with the church? For example, in the 3rd century, the heroes of faith were the martyrs and the confessors, but they sometimes lapsed and failed under the threat of persecution. Some churches were too lax and admitted those straight back in, as if nothing had happened. Others were too harsh and never let them back into the church or to be used by God. Most churches did the right thing, I suppose, and they allowed the lapsed people to come back at some stage, basically as beginners again, not pretending as if nothing had happened. And here, Abram came back to the promised land basically as a beginner. He's starting again with God. He came to Bethel, back with his tent, back to the altar, back to what it should have been. God wants us to be in that situation, not just when we do things wrong. He always wants us to be listening like beginners. The contention, though, happens in verses 5 to 7 with Abram and Lot's, his nephew's, workers. It says in verse 5, Lot also, who went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. Now the land was not able to support them, that they might dwell together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. The Canaanites and the Perizzites then dwelt in the land. Okay. Lot also, who went with Abraham. That's interesting. God commanded Abram to leave his family behind when he came to Canaan, but Abram brought his nephew Lot with him. Trouble like this was a result. This conflict came after Abram did the right thing. When we get right with God, we can often expect there to be some form of attack from the devil. There was strife between the staff of Abram and Lot, basically is what we're saying. Something had to be done about this strife between the estates of Abram and Lot, because they couldn't continue in conflict, nor was the land capable of looking after all of them. When the Canaanites and the Perizzites, they dwelt there, they saw the men of Abraham and Lot fighting. They must have said, they're just like us. They worship another God, a God who said he is the true God, but really they're just like us, they fight. Many people will never listen to what another believer says because of what some other believers say about them. Isn't it sad that there's so many tensions within churches, within Christian circles? But do notice that their possessions were so great. There was a great difference between riches of Abraham and riches of Lot. They had both got really rich. Now, Uncle Abraham is really generous to his nephew Lot. Listen to verse 8 and 9. So Abram said to Lot, "Please let there be no strife between you and me, between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is it not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you take the left, then I will go to the right. Or if you go to the right, then I will go to the left." See what's happening? Is not the whole land before you? Abraham was the eldest of the two, and God given him all the land, and not to Lot, mind you. It is pure generosity on Abram's part that causes him to offer this. He must have really loved the dude. If you take the tent, then I will. If you take the left, then I will go to the right. Abraham was able to, say, you make the decision. You make the decisions. A few acres of grazing land didn't seem worth fighting about when you look at it from an eternal perspective. God was glorified when Paul, out of love, waived his right to be supported by the gospel. If you want to read that, it's in 1 Corinthians 9. God was glorified when Jesus, out of love, waived his right to an existence that knew no human suffering or trial by experience. Do you get that too? Abraham fulfilled the New Testament principle of love. Let us each look out not only for his own interests, but the interests of others. That's in Philippians 2, but it goes right back to this chapter in Genesis. If you go to the right, then I will go to the left, right or left. Abram knew he could trust God wherever he was. He did it because he'd learned God would provide for his needs. He did not have to worry about how green the grass was. Abram knew whatever Lot chose, God would make sure that Abram prospered.